And so this is what I was talking about with multifamily and non-residential against single-family. It's evergreen trees and shrubs, and that it has to be completely on the side of the developing use. Loading areas are screened with the landscape buffers. The rear facades of single-family residential. This is one of those places where single-family is subject to these regulations. So if you've got a subdivision that's coming up on the bypass, they've got an internal road network, and some of those lots would have the homes with the rears facing the bypass. That's okay as long as the landscaping is adhering to these standards so that you're not seeing the backs of houses. And then the parking areas, there's an illustration on the next slide, just the idea of having some screening where you do have parking adjacent to the bypass, that is screened. If it's visible from the corridor, it's screened with 3-foot shrubs at planting.
Meg, are they required, if we have a natural disaster like a Hugo come through and knock the trees down in a residential area where we were putting the screens, behind to screen the back of the houses, are they then required to replant the trees to put the screen back up?
I would think that would be certainly something that would be needed. The time frame, I'm not sure how quickly that would be required, but you'd want that reestablished, even if it's existing vegetation that came out, because you still want that same relationship maintained. Lighting. So, when you've got this whole bypass in the streetscape and being held to a certain quality, you would also expect that the light fixtures would have some consistency as well. So what we're suggesting here with this provision is that it's in accordance with a lighting plan or even an overall streetscape plan that specifies what those lighting fixtures should be. So that would be something that would probably be developed by the town, or at least a standard selected, so if it's done privately, everybody's using the same fixture. And then we've with the help of the committee and the Planning Commission, just acknowledging that it's really important that this lighting provides adequate lighting on the pedestrian pathways themselves. So if it's out there, it really needs to serve that purpose. All the pathways within this district would be 8 feet, and they'd be constructed of, I think I've got the materials in the next one, but obviously along the corridor and along any public roads that these parcels would abut. But it's also really important to promote that pedestrian connection by bringing sidewalks of the same width into development, the non-residential and the multifamily, so people can actually leave the street on foot and go towards those buildings. You will also have instances where at the fronts of buildings connecting to those customer entrances and around the parking lots, so that as much as you can get people, even if you're arriving by car, as soon as you get out of your car, you're a pedestrian. So being able to give people connected internal sidewalk connections through there is important for the pedestrian safety. So that's what these provisions are about. And they can be wider to accommodate some seating for restaurants and other street furnishings. That's just an illustration of what's meant by coming in from the street, crossing a parking lot, having perhaps a crosswalk that has different pavers through there, and then getting to a primary entrance and sidewalk along the fronts of buildings. No pathway should be closer than 8 feet to the back of curb or the edge of pavement of a travel lane. And the pavement of these facilities really need to be something that's going to be durable over the long term. So concrete or concrete pavers, brick, combination of those are all acceptable materials. These pathways would be constructed by the developer as development's occurring. So that's an important note to make there, is that they get constructed with development, and then should the town accept maintenance for some or all of those facilities, that would be something that would be worked out between the developer and the town, but the town would have to take those over for maintenance. And otherwise it is the responsibility of the developer, or ultimately the property owners association, or the management of whoever's managing that property. In some instances, you may find that it is just more feasible for the developer to be able to pay fees in lieu, and it could have a lot to do with the phasing of development. An example that came up with the committee or the Planning Commission was, what if you have one of those instances where you're trying to construct the walkway out along the corridor and you want it to adjoin to the next property, so when it develops it can pick up where you leave off and continue that path. Well, you may be crossing a creek at that point or something like that, and being able to build half a pedestrian bridge at that point doesn't work. So when on a case-by-case basis, you may find that it's just better to have the developer pay fees in lieu, so when it's the right time to make those connections, that funding is available to go ahead and do it at a time that makes sense. These pedestrian pathways and CODN should be provided along the corridor within 15 feet of the right-of-way, just to be able to get that continuous path following the bypass in those areas. And then you'll have some instances where, because it's taking on an urban condition, that relationship of the paved areas of the sidewalks to the street, it may make more sense to go ahead and carry the pavement out to the back of curb and have street trees in tree grades. And that's, that allows for some street furnishings and in front of retail and restaurants, some seating areas and things like that. But as long as you're keeping that clear zone for pedestrians of 8 feet, that's something you should be able to allow. The last two notes are about extending it to the side property lines so that the next developer can pick up where that development left off. An internal pedestrian circulation I've already mentioned, but the way it connects, just being able to, I think I've already mentioned the outdoor seating, but just being able to go from one property to the next, where you're walking in front of some shops, being able to connect across, and even if you're leaving that property and going to another one, that internal network is also important. So we're not just talking about out at the corridor, but also internal to the site, so trying to make those connections with stub outs. And I think we've got another slide about that, Joe, with the some of the details within. Yes, this is a lot of detail here, but it's trying to recognize, okay, what if you develop first and you're trying to leave your sidewalk stubbed out in a place where the next piece of property can pick up in a reasonable place. So that whole idea of where you're stubbing out, you sort of need to look beyond your property boundaries and decide whether or not it's feasible for somebody to pick up in that location. So being mindful of exactly where you're stubbing out. And then if you're coming after somebody, your internal network planning needs to look at where those stub outs are on the adjacent properties, if the adjacent properties have in fact already developed. The driveways on the corridor, trying to limit them as much as possible, so one per property. And then the 400-foot distance is an SCDOT standard, being able to keep intersections of various driveways and roads coming out onto the bypass at not less than 400 feet in spacing. Encouraging the use of shared driveways, parallel access, cross-access easements, those kinds of things, to be able to minimize people's need to have a driveway on the bypass and try to get people off the bypass and circulating internally. Even the side streets help a great deal in providing that access, so that it's not a lot of turning movements off the bypass and hindering those movements. And then just a few things about being able to have that. This is the access easements, so that you've got parcels that are adjacent to each other, allowing access across, so that you don't have the need for redundant driveways and other access points. But just a little bit about that to give the town council an ability to adjust on a case-by-case basis. Off-street parking, it really needs to be to the side or rear of buildings that are immediately adjacent to the corridor. Where you've got some parking needs, those would have to be screened from view from the bypass, so you will be able to see parking lots in some places. It will not be a continuous wall of buildings, and so the screening comes into play, and the landscaping of the parking lots will also help a lot to minimize that visual impact. There are some instances where you're going to need to be able to have some parking in front of the building, but it's limited to one bay if you have that. And of course, the parking from public view, even if it's kind of at an angle, you still need to screen it if it's from public view. So, and then shared parking, we don't want to overdo it on the parking. So to the extent that you can have an agreement with your neighbor, if you've got complementary uses where one parcel's using that parking during the day and the other use, the neighboring use, really needs that parking at night, that shared agreement. And as long as it's within 1,200 feet of the use that you have, it can be off-site. Bicycle parking. We don't want to lose sight of the fact that some people, if we do a great job with our connections here, that some people can actually get through this whole area on bike, not just on foot or by car. And so being able to have some bike racks located in very visible spots that are well lighted and connected to the buildings that they're serving, locating those. So there are some parking requirements for bikes. If you're over a certain size building, and if you've got two uses that are side by side, it's perfectly acceptable for those two uses if they each, by the calculation, are required to have a couple of spaces, but not more. Just being able to do one bike rack that might have 4 or 5 bike spaces and have that serve 2 or more uses. That makes sense. The on-street parking. Some amount of your parking requirements can be met with on-street parking as long as it's within 1,200 feet, and the map that you submit with your development to demonstrate that you are providing an adequate number of parking spaces would need to show exactly what spaces you're counting to meet that minimum requirement. Okay, this is getting back to your question about signs, and so we certainly don't want the whole corridor littered with signs, and so the freestanding signs in particular what we're addressing with these provisions. And so if you have a parcel that's under 50 feet, we wouldn't expect that you would have a sign out there on the bypass. You can still have your wall sign and other types of signs on site, but that identification sitting out on the bypass would not apply to parcels that have less than 50 feet of frontage. If you're 50 to 200 feet, you have these size requirements of 4 feet in height, and then you can get up to 30 square feet on sign face, and you need to be set back 5 feet from the right-of-way at least. If you get over 200 feet, you can go up in height, up in square footage of that face, and you're still set back from the right-of-way a little bit. You've got some good standards already in your ordinance for unified development, so we don't want to alter those, but instead bring those in and suggest that if you are doing unified development, that you can still follow those standards. If you get over 300 feet in frontage, then you can go up again. So a height of 22 feet for the sign, 250 square feet. You're set back a little bit more because of the scale of that type of sign, and we don't want those too close together. So a minimum separation of 350 feet, which is also recognizing that 400-foot distance between driveways. That gives you the flexibility to do those at a couple entrances. There's some language about the lighting of signs, the different types of lighting. One of the things that came up during this process is, you get those displays that you can change easily for gas prices or time and temperature. You want to be able to do a little bit of that, so there's a limitation on how much of your sign face you can devote to that, but we didn't want to not allow that along this corridor. And go ahead, Joe. When this corridor gets right up against 77, and so the ability to do some pole signs is still okay here. So if you're within 150 feet of that right-of-way and you want to do a pole sign, you can follow the pole sign standards that are already in your code. Wall-mounted signs, you can still do all those, whatever your underlying zoning allows, and the temporary signs, this does not affect those at all. Traffic signals, the main thing here is that we really want to have the steel post with the mast arm, so if it's warranted, you're going to have a signal in new development out here that's the type of signal support you would be using. And then utilities, this one has the orange box around it because this is a recent addition and clarification. And that is, we want all the utilities to be underground because we all know what they can do visually to your streetscape, and so with new development, it needs to go underground as much as possible. If for some reason it cannot be feasibly put underground, then being able to locate it along the backs or sides of property lines where it can be screened or just sort of taken out of view and screened by buildings or landscaping, that needs to be done. One of the things that was brought to our attention is there are instances when you need to have them above ground temporarily. So the next slide shows a little bit of language about the idea that you can do that, but there needs to be an agreement in place that identifies exactly what the condition is going to be and for how long. So there's an expectation that after a certain period of time, the agreement would specify when those utilities would have to go underground. The walls and fences, there are some details in there about the heights and the treatment of those, of the walls and fences. But as you're in the rear and side yards, you can go to 6 feet with those walls and fences, and then as you come out in front of the front facade of the principal structure, you drop to 4 feet. They can't be in the right-of-way, and on corner lots, you have to treat that side yard like a front yard. So if you're in a side yard and you're getting out past the facade of the principal structure, it drops to the 4 feet as if it was a front facade. This is what I was talking about before with the retaining walls. You can certainly do, the one on the right is that one we fear of just, what that visually looks like, but it's doing the job of retaining the significant area. At the rears of, shopping centers and things like that, where you might expect to find that in a loading zone or something like that, that you would expect, but you don't want to see something like that in your setbacks out on the bypass. And so the one on the left is just an illustration of what a setback might allow for in that terracing of retaining walls, so that you can create something that looks a little bit better as your front door. The finishes, it's sort of what you would expect, that the nice side needs to go to the outside where it's visible from public view or your neighbors. The materials, colors, textures, you would want those to be consistent with or in concert with the materials of the development, the building architecture. And then also being able to keep those things at least 6 inches off the property line, because when it comes to maintenance of that fence or wall that you've constructed, being able to get to it without going on your neighbor's property, that's at least 6 inches would allow that. You're going to have instances where there's something on a case-by-case basis. As you look at this, there's some standards that maybe somebody can't meet. And so being able to allow for some departure from one or more of these standards, you may need to be able to do. And so the topography out there with the pedestrian pathways, that's one example. It may be pretty hard in some places with the topography to get that path down alongside the corridor. So being able to make adjustments where there's still pedestrian connections, but it may not be exactly as envisioned with these regulations. So this language is in here just to be able to give the town some ability to look at something on a case-by-case basis, be reasonable, and look at what an alternative might be as proposed by the developer. The next slide suggests that there are 3 findings: that what's being proposed meets the intent of the overlay district, that there truly are some physical conditions that would prevent you from meeting these standards, and that all the other standards, to the extent possible, are being met. If those findings can't be made, then the Board of Zoning Adjustment would have to be required. A variance from them would be required, and then anything that would just be a staff decision that is not acceptable, then you can certainly appeal that. So being able to have some avenues where you can work with developers and be able to take into account those very site-specific conditions and still make sure that what you're really trying to achieve with this overlay district can actually be achieved. So that's it in a nutshell. So a lot of details, and I'm happy to answer any questions about any of that if you want to back up to anything, or if you saw something in here that we didn't cover in the presentation.
Any question or comment from Ed?
How many zoning people are going to have to add to enforce this thing? If going back to the number of driveway permits, and it can't be within 300 feet of a intersection, is that right?
The spacing would be 400 feet, and that's
400 feet then.
That's
what if I had if I bought a 200-foot lot, can I not have a driveway?
You can't. Let's go back to that.
If I was on the corner?
That might have been, it's too far.